Right, so in terms of European contact and ethnographic data, 1542 we have Juan Cabrillo. Cabrillo Community College is named after Juan Cabrillo. Spanish explorers are starting to come up to California and kind of figure out, their new territory and what they've inherited here. Spanish Jesuits start to establish in Baja California, in Sur, Baja California. 1697, they start to establish missions. They're going to expand that. 1767, the Spanish kick out the Jesuits and bring in Father Serra, Juniper Serra, who's been canonized in 2015, to establish the mission system in Alta California, and this is where we get all of our missions from San Diego all the way up to Sonoma, and everything in between. This picture here is actually San Juan Bautista mission. And again, Juan Bautista, John the Baptist. This is John the Baptist. This is an interesting element of syncretism, which is that blending of cultural ideas. This is during the winter solstice. The sun basically ends up right in John the Baptist's hands there and shines right into the church. So what you have is an interesting alignment of Catholicism with kind of the earth and the sun, which tends to be more of a Native American kind of tradition. Hard to say whether or not there was a Native American sacred site located here. Usually missions were kind of around those sites. I do know that in this particular area, about a mile or two to the southeast, there was Sacred Hill. Now there is it was a sacred hill for the Native Americans, probably part of their creation story, the Ohlone, the Munson Ohlone down there. Ultimately, currently it has a gigantic cross on it. At one point the cross was made out of wood. It was burnt down by the local Ohlone, and then the owners ultimately put in a concrete cross. So there's still a concrete cross today up on Sacred Hill that is a Native American site. Again, this is the San Juan Bautista mission. There's something like 500 to 2,000 dead Native Ohlone in the back of this mission. And the whole town is based on this mission. To be honest, if you guys ever get a chance and you're driving from up the 101 and pass by San Juan Bautista, it's kind of an interesting place that you can kind of walk around and see a lot. There's also Fremont's Peak, where Fremont was and started to kind of claim California for the United States, is in the same region, so you can kind of do both at the same time. I recommend it. Anyway, in terms of this mission, it's hard and depressing, especially when you get to the backside, and ultimately there's a plaque that says that this is a Native Ohlone burial ground, which is kind of down further. Forced relocation, right? A lot of these missions were basically slave holdings. The priest would gather people up and pay people to gather natives and bring them to them for slave labor, and then they would hold them there and make them do some bad stuff, work, farming, all of that kind of stuff. 1803, Russian fur traders get down to Fort Ross on the Sonoma coast, Bodega Bay, that region. So now you have some Russian influence in the north coast of California. Mexico, when they basically take over from Spain, their land area, which included California, they ultimately end the mission system in 1824, and then another 24 years later, California is kind of controlled by the United States after the Mexican-American War. Disease, obviously massive. California was not like the subarctic or the Arctic, where everybody was spread out a lot. They were highly inhabited. There was a ton of Native Americans in California, and a lot of contact. And ultimately, disease wiped a ton of these people out. We don't even have real numbers because the Spanish were kind of in there doing this mission thing prior to really gathering data on this. And it might have wiped something like 90% of people out. Early ethnographies include Stephen Powers, late 1800s. He's going to do some ethnography work of California natives. And then we get Alfred Kroeber. Kroeber's the main focus of Ishi at Berkeley. And then we have J.P. Harrington, who's a linguist and also does a bunch of ethnographic work for the national ethnology kind of group that is sponsored by the government. does a lot of work in California as well. Robert Lowy ends up in Berkeley, so there's a decent amount. However, currently there's just not a ton being done, and we'll kind of discuss that when we get into the current California natives. Socio-political organization. This is where it gets dicey, and obviously I'm going to have a more drawn out conversation around this topic. The unique thing that happens with California natives is that we have chiefs in hunter-gatherer societies. Remember, hunter-gatherer societies tend to not have political organization or structure. Now, the tough part here is, again, is this by title only? Does it mean something different? When we get into the social organization, ultimately there are things that we call dual chiefs, right, down there at the egalitarian band groups. And so these kind of counterbalance political power. But it's, again, fascinating to have chiefs in hunter-gatherer societies that are sedentary villages. Okay, so you have a hunter-gatherer society, usually in moving bands, sedentary, semi-sedentary, where you live basically in the same village, which may be why we have a chief, to keep village peace. Okay, but it's still hunter-gatherer. And this is why people ask, why weren't California natives agriculturalists? Why were they not planting things? And again, it's because nature itself was a giant field producing food where you did a certain harvest during the year, but you didn't have to tend it. You did not have to tend. You didn't have to keep the rodents out. The oak trees kept producing acorns, and they just dropped every fall. And ultimately, this is where your food came from. Same with the ocean, right? The food just kept jumping out. Ultimately, a lot of these chiefdoms were ascribed status, so that they were acquired through birthright, and not all the time. Sometimes they were achieved. So again, different types of status among chiefdoms. The Napa Valley group is fascinating. I went up to a talk last year, and the archaeologist and anthropologist in that area ultimately described the Napa Valley as an interesting place where other California natives were like this. And this is where some of these generalizations that Sutton does in the book start to not really tell the complete story. And the Napa Valley, again, they had a chief, but literally the chief, and I might have told you guys this already because it's a funny story. The chief was literally the village rooster. He would come out, and his job was to wake everybody up in the morning. Okay, but what you had on the other side was a council of women, the women's council. They're the ones that really made all the decisions for the group. So what we have is a balance of title as chief and council of people actually doing the work and thinking up the big thoughts. So we have a counterbalance of power. This is kind of going back to more of an egalitarian society in a way too, right? A little bit of a holdover. If you only have one male chief and it's not all self-government, that's a little bit of difference. But again, you can see this kind of fluid line of egalitarianism to ranked societies, and we're moving along that line, right? But we're still holding over this village council, which is self-government to a certain degree. The chiefdoms and confederacy, it's a loose confederacy, really are attributed to the groups like Chumash. The Chumash are one of your kind of case studies at the end of the chapter. Fascinating group of people. Think of the Santa Barbara coast, Channel Islands, that whole area. They occupied a boatload of land all the way into the kind of western side of the Central Valley as well. Very successful seagoing people. Their boat technology looks more like Polynesian. So if you guys want to do more research on the Chumash, my former professor Lynn Gamble, who's at UC Santa Barbara, ultimately was looking into these. Was there contact with the Polynesians and the Chumash because of this boat technology and a harpoon and some interesting stuff there. So if you guys want to do some further research, I suggest the Chumash are one of those fascinating groups to look at. Symbolic war in the Ohlone Way. We'll talk more about this when it comes up, but your book talks about some war being done and maybe even taking heads as a trophy, and this could happen, but in general, especially with the Ohlone, warfare was not necessarily about killing a bunch of people. A lot of them practice symbolic war where you line up your warriors on both sides. Your top hunter comes out on this side, your top hunter comes out on this side, and then everybody shoots arrows at those two people. Once somebody's injured, then ultimately the war is over and a truce is made. So this is symbolic war, ritual war. Remember, it's to minimize casualties, and a lot of people would say is more civilized than our total war system. Social organizations is based on lineages, then to clans, then to moieties, which again, moieties are kind of this connected totem clan. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours, in terms of ceremonial privileges and rights and reciprocity around those issues. So it's almost like an allyship around this kind of structure of almost lineage, really, and gets into the different kind of organizations of lineages. There were, for sure, ranked societies and social stratification. There was wealth. The Chumash had beads as currency. And really, when you look into the economic structure of the Chumash, it's one of your guided lesson questions. It's important to realize that there was definitely wealth and currency going on with the Chumash. And a lot of these shell beads were part of this currency process, along with, of course, trade and barter were among the California natives' economic systems as well. But a lot of times if there was a chief that inherited wealth and power and status, we're talking about a scribe status, so they got it from their parents, right? There was social stratification with certain groups, but also there was egalitarian. So we had the whole spectrum of egalitarian and everything in between, up to ranked society and chiefdoms among the Chumash. Now remember, fascinating group. I had you guys look at the Kwaiasu as part of the Great Basin group. They're kind of a both group. The reason why they put them with the Great Basin is the language group looks more Great Basin. But in terms of their activities, they also farmed acorns. So they had the pinyon nut thing going, but they also had acorns and a lot of contact with your California natives. You had the contact with the Central Valley peoples and then even into the Chumash. But again, the fascinating thing here, okay, we have a two-spirit person who was a third gender, remember, was actually the chief in this community. So highest status that you can get is chief. And then the two-spirit, which is the third gender, was chief among the Kwaiasu or the Nuwa people here in Tehachapi. So again, some fascinating kind of facts of everything in between, from egalitarian all the way to ranked, and what that looked like, and who could have the rank and who couldn't. And again, your book doesn't really talk about female chiefs. They definitely existed, and there was the whole everything in between. It doesn't even really talk about gender roles much. And the reason being is that a lot of men did acorn crush and harvest, and women hunted, right? So the gender roles were kind of swapped. Again, egalitarian groups with dual chiefs. Sometimes you had two chiefs, and it was more of like a council that made decisions based on two groups. Exogamous is, remember, you're marrying outside of the group. This tended to be the way that things were in California. There were matrilineal, bilineal, and matrilineal or patrilineal lineages all the way through California, although your book points out that patrilineal seems to be more of what was happening in California. Division of labor, again, was flexible. Talked about that. Rites of passage and puberty rites. This is also important. We'll get into this when we talk more about the religious stuff among these individuals. Remember, rites of passage is a clear delineation from your adolescence or childhood into your adulthood. And usually after this rites of passage, then your relatives would start to talk with other relatives, and you would start to get an arranged marriage. Remember, most marriages back in the day, in these gerontocracies where the elders were more valued, children trusted their parents or their grandparents to make wise choices about their future mate, and which they did. Remember, if people are getting married at 14, 15, 16, maybe the parents do know more about this than the children. Although in America, obviously, this is taboo. We have an independent streak to us, which is we should be kind of deciding these things on our own. And so ultimately, this rites of passage is very, very important. It's both boys and girls. It's not just boys or just girls. It's different in different places. Some places focus on certain hallucinogenic drugs. Some places focus on consuming fire ants and some of these other things. I mean, there's a boatload of these rites of passage, really, and ultimately they are very, very important in terms of gaining adult status, and actually, really, part of gaining that adult status, usually in an egalitarian society, meant that you had a vote in decision making. Okay, so really important in terms of term for this class.